Early morning, August 30th, 1940. A thin veil of coastal fog rolled across the English Channel as a formation of German reconnaissance aircraft rose into the pale light. Their orders were simple: confirm the collapse of the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe believed that Britain, battered by weeks of relentless air attacks, was on its last legs. Fighter command had taken heavy hits. Sector stations were burning. And German intelligence claimed that the RAF had fewer than 100 serviceable fighters left. Inside one of the reconnaissance aircraft, an observer leaned over his camera, scanning the English countryside below. He saw the same thing he had seen for weeks: damaged runways, smoking hangars, and the scars of bomb craters stretching across southern Britain. To the Luftwaffe, it looked like the RAF's backbone had finally snapped. What he did not see, what not a single German pilot saw that morning, was the network of secret RAF airfields hidden beneath harmless layers of farmland, hedgerows, forests, and industries that seemed completely ordinary. Some were satellite fields, some were freshly cut patches of grass that looked like nothing from above, and some were so well deceived that they appeared even in reconnaissance photos as quiet acres of countryside. But those hidden bases carried the weight of Britain's survival. And in the next few weeks, they would prove that the RAF was far from finished. The belief that the RAF was collapsing did not emerge overnight. It grew slowly, fed by reports, assumptions, and an overconfidence that seeped into the Luftwaffe during the late summer of 1940. Every day, reconnaissance crews returned with photographs showing smoke curling upward from British airfields. Hangars were shattered, workshops burned, craters stretched across runways like claw marks. On paper, it looked like destruction on a scale no air force could sustain. German aircrew reported less resistance during certain raids. Fighters that had once pounced on intruders now appeared sporadically. Some Luftwaffe pilots claimed that British interception patterns looked disorganized, as if the RAF was struggling to coordinate its dwindling forces. Goering seized on these observations. To him, it confirmed what he had predicted all along. Britain would fall without the need for a full-scale invasion. Intelligence officers reinforced this confidence. Their estimates of British fighter losses, though wildly inaccurate, were repeated often and enthusiastically. They believed that the RAF had lost hundreds of fighters in July and August, and that British factories could never replace them fast enough. Reports suggested that by early September, the RAF would have nothing left but a thin trickle of serviceable aircraft. German commanders trusted their reconnaissance too much. They believed that if a runway looked cratered, it was unusable. If a hangar was destroyed, they assumed the aircraft inside were gone. And if a sector station had taken heavy bomb damage, they concluded the entire fighter network must be collapsing. They never understood how much of the RAF's real infrastructure lay beyond the lens of their cameras. The Luftwaffe saw damage. They saw chaos. But they never saw the preparations Britain had been building for years, preparations designed to withstand exactly this kind of beating. What the Germans believed was an air force on the brink was in reality an air force fighting in two layers. One visible, damaged, and deliberately exposed, and one hidden, healthy, and growing stronger than anyone in Germany realized. Long before the first German bomb fell on Britain, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding understood a dangerous truth. If the RAF relied only on its major air bases, fighter command could be wiped out in a matter of days. The Luftwaffe had more planes, more crews, and more experience. If war came, those large sector stations, Biggin Hill, Tangmere, Kenley Hornchurch, would be obvious targets, and the Germans would hit them again and again. So Dowding pushed for a strategy that seemed simple on the surface, but would prove decisive in the Battle of Britain: dispersal. Instead of treating each main airfield as a single fixed point on a map, the RAF built a network around it. For every major sector station, there were satellite airfields, smaller, often unmarked strips of grass or thin runways cut into farmland near the parent base. Some were only used for emergencies. Some were used for full operations, and some were kept so secret that many RAF personnel did not know they existed until they were ordered to land on them. These weren't traditional airfields, with wide concrete runways visible from the sky. Many were simply patches of closely trimmed turf. Others were former estates whose gardens and fields had been flattened just enough to allow a Hurricane or Spitfire to take off. From above, they looked like nothing more than ordinary English countryside. Britain took the idea even further, with its shadow factory network deliberately spreading aircraft production across the Midlands so no single bombing raid could cripple fighter output. But the real defensive weapon wasn't the factories themselves, it was what they fed. A fleet of fighters that the Germans never knew Britain still had. Dowding's philosophy was simple. If the main airfields took damage, fighters could scatter to the shadows, and when the time came to strike back, they would launch from places the Germans had never seen. These satellite fields were not listed on public maps. Workers were briefed in strict secrecy, and many were designed with no permanent buildings at all, just camouflaged dispersal bays, fuel trucks hidden in hedgerows, and tents tucked beneath trees. From the sky, German reconnaissance aircraft photographed what they believed was the entire RAF infrastructure, but they were seeing only the surface, the decoys, the damaged, the obvious. Beneath that surface was an entire reserve system built, specifically to survive sustained attack. The Luftwaffe assumed they were crushing the RAF's ability to launch fighters. In truth, they were only damaging the parts Britain wanted them to see. The secret airfields were only half the story. The other half, the part that fooled the Luftwaffe completely, was the extraordinary British talent for deception. In 1940, while the skies over Britain roared with dogfights, entire teams of engineers, artists, farmers, and camouflage experts were quietly rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. They understood a simple truth. The human eye, especially from a few thousand feet in the air, wants patterns. It looks for straight lines, geometric shapes, and artificial order. So the British made sure their hidden airfields had none of these things. Some satellite airfields had runways that weren't paved at all. They were simply grass cut in broader strips, blending seamlessly into the surrounding farmland. To a German reconnaissance pilot flying at high altitude, these places looked like ordinary pastures. Other airfields used a more advanced trick: false hedgerows and painted shadows. British camouflage units studied how trees cast shade across fields and reproduced those patterns using dyes, nets, and brushstrokes so accurate that even trained observers couldn't distinguish real from fake. Engineers built lightweight wooden barns and tractors to create the illusion of rural life. Farmers were hired to plough fields right up to the edges of runways, disguising the smooth landing surface beneath the rustic chaos of an English countryside scene. Then came the decoys, arguably the most brilliant layer of deception. These were the famous Q sites and K sites. Q sites were nighttime decoy airfields equipped with dim lights arranged to mimic a runway. When the Luftwaffe bombed the lights, thinking they were hitting a real airstrip, their bombs fell harmlessly into empty fields. K sites were daytime decoys, complete with fake aircraft made of canvas and wood. German pilots photographed these decoys repeatedly, believing they had discovered genuine targets. The fake aircraft were sometimes so convincing that RAF ground crews joked they should try flying them. This deception was not merely clever, it was life-saving. Every bomb dropped on a decoy field was a bomb not falling on Biggin Hill or Kenley or Tangmere. And every German reconnaissance report that failed to identify a real satellite airfield allowed the RAF to continue operating in secret. German photo interpreters sitting in dark rooms in occupied France pored over their images. They circled hangars, counted craters, and wrote confident assessments of British weakening, but they consistently missed the truth. They didn't see refueling trucks tucked under nets of burlap and foliage. They didn't see workshops hidden inside barns. They didn't see hurricanes parked beneath trees, their wings painted to mimic patches of grass. And most importantly, they didn't see the runways that weren't supposed to exist. The Luftwaffe believed they had crippled the RAF's infrastructure, but the more they bombed, the more Britain expanded its hidden operational network. The Germans were striking shadows, illusions, and empty fields, while the real fighting force remained largely untouched. By the time they realized that something was wrong, the damage had already been done, not to Britain, but to the Luftwaffe's own strategy. For the men flying Spitfires and Hurricanes, these secret airfields were more than strategic abstractions, they were lifelines. When a main sector station took a direct hit, when runways were cratered, or when incoming raids made landing impossible, pilots were ordered to divert immediately to satellite fields that often appeared on no public maps and were known only by code names. One of the best examples was RAF Kenley, a major frontline station repeatedly hammered by the Luftwaffe. To German reconnaissance, Kenley appeared to be collapsing under the weight of sustained bombing, but what they never saw were its satellites, Caterham and Redhill tucked away behind tree lines and farmland. These fields absorbed the pressure whenever Kenley was hit. When Kenley's runways were cratered, fighters simply lifted off from its hidden satellites instead. From the German perspective, it looked impossible. They had struck Kenley again and again, yet hurricanes still rose to fight. The same was true of Biggin Hill, another prime German target. Its operational capability should have been destroyed by repeated raids, yet it continued launching fighters at full strength. The secret lay in its satellites, including West Malling and Godstone, which handled refueling and repairs, while Biggin Hill appeared battered and barely functional. German commanders believed they were suffocating Fighter Command's most important airfield. In reality, they were attacking an illusion. Further south, RAF Tangmere relied on its satellite at West Hampnet, an airfield carved into a rural estate that today hosts the world-famous Goodwood Motor Circuit. Back in 1940, however, it was invisible to German reconnaissance. Pilots landing there taxied along lanes bordered by hedges and trees, refueled under nets, and returned to combat within minutes. These hidden airfields weren't built with long-term comfort in mind. Some had no permanent buildings. Crews worked out of tents or small huts buried under camouflage. Aircraft were often parked in dispersal bays, carved into the edges of forests or hidden in orchards. Engines were repaired in barns so old and weathered that German scouts never gave them a second look. Ground crews slept in makeshift shelters and ate quickly, knowing another scramble could be called at any moment. The system was beautifully simple. A squadron could fight from its main base in the morning, land at a satellite by midday to escape incoming German bombers and rejoin the battle by afternoon. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe wasted resources, attacking main stations that were no longer hosting aircraft. To German intelligence, it created a maddening paradox. Their records showed airfields flattened, hangars destroyed, and runways cratered. Yet British fighters kept appearing, not fewer but in steady waves that made no sense based on the damage they believed they had inflicted. Without realizing it, the Luftwaffe was fighting an air force that had become partially invisible. By late August and early September of 1940, frustration had begun to seep into the Luftwaffe's command structure. What had seemed like a straightforward campaign crush, the RAF achieve air superiority and force Britain to the negotiating table, was turning into something far stranger. German pilots returned from missions with stories that simply didn't align with intelligence reports. Airfields they had bombed into apparent ruin continued launching fighters. Runways they had cratered remained inexplicably functional. And the RAF's presence in the sky was not diminishing. If anything, it was holding steady. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters in France, confusion spread. Reconnaissance photographs showed vast scars on Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, Tangmere. Yet squadrons operating from those same stations met German formations in the sky day after day. When Goering demanded explanations, his officers had none that made sense. Some blamed the weather. Some accused British ground crews of repairing runways faster than humanly possible. Others speculated that the RAF was pulling fighters from Scotland or northern England to reinforce the southern front. None of those theories explained the real problem. The Luftwaffe's entire intelligence system was built around a critical assumption. If we do not see it, it does not exist. It was an orderly, logical way of thinking, but unforgivingly rigid. If reconnaissance aircraft photographed 3 airfields in a sector, the Luftwaffe concluded that only those 3 airfields could support fighter operations. If 2 were badly damaged, they assumed the RAF had only 1 remaining. Meanwhile, British pilots were landing on grass runways the Germans never photographed, refueling under trees the Germans never noticed, and returning to combat from locations the Germans didn't know existed. The turning point came when German formations expected light resistance, but were instead met by large coordinated groups of RAF fighters, groups far larger than German officers believed the RAF still had. Pilots complained that they were being swarmed by British fighters, even on days when the Luftwaffe had supposedly destroyed entire sector stations the day before. Something wasn't adding up. Inside German command rooms, maps began to look wrong. Their projections of RAF strength were no longer matching reality. Loss estimates were incorrect. And their assumptions about British aircraft production based on pre-war industrial surveys were wildly off the places. Mark. At one heated meeting, a commander reportedly snapped that the RAF must be growing fighters in the ground like potatoes. It was said as a joke, but it captured the bewilderment perfectly. Every time the Luftwaffe believed fighter command was on its last legs, more British fighters appeared. The Germans were beginning to sense that they were fighting not just an air force, but a system, a flexible, hidden, adaptive system they had never prepared for. And the deeper that realization sank, the more the Luftwaffe's confidence began to crack. The strength of fighter command in those critical weeks did not come from a single technological breakthrough or a dramatic surge of reinforcements. It came from something far more subtle, a rhythm, a cycle of launching, landing, hiding, refueling and relaunching that the Luftwaffe could neither disrupt nor decipher. The secret airfields formed the invisible gears of that machine, turning constantly beneath the German bombing campaign. When a squadron finished an engagement, pilots didn't always return to their parent station. Instead, controllers directed them to whichever satellite field was safest at that moment. A pilot might take off from Biggin Hill, at dawn fight over Kent, by midday land at Godstone to refuel and return to the fight from West Malling in the afternoon. German reconnaissance, relying on snapshots taken hours before, simply could not track these shifts in real time. This mobility allowed the RAF to operate with an almost stubborn resilience. German bombers targeted main airfields expecting to ground British fighters, but the fighters were no longer there. When craters tore across a runway, aircraft used a satellite. When a hangar collapsed, maintenance crews moved to a barn or a tent hidden under netting. Damage that should have crippled a squadron only slowed it for minutes or hours, not days. Meanwhile, the shadow factory system across the Midlands fed the sky with a steady stream of new Hurricanes, Spitfires. German planners had assumed that British industry would buckle under pressure. Instead, the factories dispersed, camouflaged and shielded from easy targeting ramped up production. The RAF was replacing lost fighters faster than the Luftwaffe realized, and in some weeks faster than the Luftwaffe itself. British controllers took full advantage of this strength. When one group of squadrons grew exhausted, they were quietly rotated north through the secret satellite network, replaced by fresh pilots and fresh aircraft, who seemed to the Germans to appear out of nowhere. A squadron that had been fighting non-stop one day could vanish into the web of satellite fields the next, only to reappear elsewhere, seemingly reborn. And then came the strategic blunder that sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. Hitler's decision in early September to shift the bombing campaign away from airfields and toward British cities. This moment, often remembered as the start of the Blitz, was built on a false, the assumption that the RAF was finished. But the RAF wasn't finished. It was recovering. The pressure on satellite airfields eased. Runway crews had time to repair damaged ground. Aircraft production surged even higher. Command centers gained breathing space to reorganize squadrons. The web of hidden fields that had held Britain together during its darkest days now stabilized completely. When the Luftwaffe returned its focus to fighter command later in the campaign, the opportunity had already slipped away. Britain had survived the breaking point. The RAF, once believed destroyed, was now a stronger, more unified force than the Luftwaffe could comprehend. The secret airfields had bought the most precious resource of all, time. Time for pilots to rest. Time for aircraft to be built. Time for tactics to adapt. And in that time, Britain found the strength to hold the line. When the war finally ended and Germany's vast military archives were opened, British and American intelligence officers found something striking buried within the Luftwaffe's paperwork. Their reconnaissance logs, the very documents German commanders had trusted, throughout the Battle of Britain were riddled with blind spots. Entire airfields had never been photographed. Others were photographed but misidentified. Dozens of RAF satellites, operating at full capacity during the height of the battle, did not appear on a single Luftwaffe map. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't laziness. It was simply that the British system of dispersal and camouflage had worked far better than even its designers expected. German officers who were interviewed after the war remembered their confusion clearly. Some admitted that they had assumed the British were using northern bases to refill southern squadrons. Others believed the RAF had far more fighters in reserve than pre-war intelligence had suggested, a theory they could never prove at the time. A few commanders even suspected that the British were somehow repairing runways faster than the Luftwaffe could damage them. None of them guessed the true scale of the deception. In the 1950s, Britain finally began releasing wartime documents detailing the satellite scheme and the deployment of Q&K decoy sites. Historians were stunned at the scope. The RAF had created an entire secondary grid of airfields, some temporary, some permanent, that didn't merely support fighter command, they multiplied it. Many of these fields slipped quietly back into civilian use after the war. Some became farmland again. Others turned into parks, housing, or quiet green spaces. A few evolved into modern airfields carrying no hint of the desperate battles once fought overhead. To an untrained eye, they look peaceful now, ordinary pieces of the English countryside. But deep beneath the soil are the faint outlines of dispersal bays, trackways, and revetments that once helped decide the fate of a nation. For decades, their story remained overshadowed by the feist and burs, heroism of the pilots who fought in the sky, and the radar operators who detected incoming raids. But the truth has slowly emerged. The Battle of Britain was not merely won in dogfights or command rooms. It was won in fields, orchards, quiet estates, and camouflaged clearings that the enemy never found. The Luftwaffe believed the RAF had been reduced to ruins. But after the war, the evidence told a very different story, one of an air force that had gone to ground, hidden its strength, and struck back with far greater resilience than its enemy ever imagined. The Luftwaffe entered the skies over southern England convinced that victory was within reach. Maps were marked, targets were identified, and every report seemed to confirm their assumptions. They believed that by crushing the visible heart of the RAF, Britain would crumble, yet they were deceived at every turn. Hidden behind trees, camouflaged under nets tucked into farmland and orchards, Britain's secret airfields quietly ensured that the fight never stopped. These invisible bases did more than preserve aircraft or pilots. They preserved hope, discipline, and the strategic initiative. They allowed fighter command to endure, adapt, and ultimately shape the course of the Battle of Britain. While the world saw burning hangars and cratered runways, the Germans never realized that the true strength of the RAF lay in what they could not see, a silent, hidden network that turned the tide of the conflict. In the end, victory was not just a matter of firepower or courage. It was a matter of foresight, ingenuity, and the quiet, relentless determination to remain unseen yet unstoppable. The Luftwaffe thought the RAF was finished. But Britain had prepared a secret weapon far more enduring than any fighter plane: time, resilience, and invisibility.